The fog in Marrow County never lifted. It crawled through the hollers, coiled around the barns, and clung to the rotting fences like it had a memory of its own. On nights when the moon was full, the fog shimmered pale silver, and that's when the Whitlock family held their ceremonies. Folks in town said it wasn't church they prayed to. Clara was 12 the night they promised her. She remembered the way her mother's hands trembled as she tied the white ribbon around her wrist, how her father's voice cracked when he said the vow aloud, and how her cousin Eli stood there older, silent, and smiling like he knew something she didn't. No one explained what the promise meant. They said it was just family tradition. But even then, Clara felt the ground breathing beneath her bare feet, as if the earth itself were listening. By the time she turned 16, the whispers had already begun. People talked about the Whitlocks' strange eyes, that eerie pale color that seemed to catch the light in ways human eyes shouldn't. Some said the family had been cursed since the Civil War, others that they'd made a pact to keep their blood pure. Clara didn't believe in any of it. Not until the first night Eli touched her, and the wind outside her window began to howl like something alive. Months later, when her stomach began to swell, the doctor said the heartbeat inside her wasn't normal. Too strong, too fast, like two hearts beating in perfect unison. He told her she might not survive the birth. But Clara didn't tell anyone what she saw in the mirror those nights, her reflection flickering, her skin turning cold under the touch of something unseen. When the baby finally came, it didn't cry. It only opened its eyes, colorless, shimmering like fog. The midwife crossed herself and ran out screaming. Eli fell to his knees, whispering, "It's a sign." Clara just stared at the child in her arms, silent and still, wondering what they had brought into this world and what price the family would pay this time. The town of Marrow County sat in a forgotten fold of the Appalachian Mountains, hidden behind a curtain of fog that never seemed to lift. Outsiders rarely found their way in, and when they did, the land seemed to swallow them whole. The hills were steep, the woods thick with black pines, and the air smelled of damp earth and old secrets. Roads wound like veins through the valleys, narrow and cracked, as if warning travelers to turn back before they reached the heart of it. The people there were quiet, tight-knit, and proud of names that had been carved into gravestones for centuries. Every house, every barn, every acre of land seemed to belong to someone related to someone else. It wasn't unusual to meet a man whose last name matched half the county's tombstones. To them, lineage wasn't just blood, it was survival. In Marrow County, the past wasn't something left behind, it lived in the soil. The same families who worked the land 200 years ago still did, their lives bound by invisible roots that no one dared cut. There was a rhythm to it all, an old, unsettling order that people didn't question. Marriages were often arranged within the family, whispered about at kitchen tables lit by oil lamps, decided long before the children even understood what a promise meant. The older generation said it kept the blood strong, the faith pure, and the blessings unbroken. But others, those few who left and tried to forget, claimed it was a curse disguised as devotion. At night, the town seemed to breathe. The fog would drift low and thick, creeping between the houses like smoke from a dying fire. Dogs wouldn't bark after sunset, and the wind carried voices that no one claimed as their own. It wasn't just superstition that kept outsiders away, it was the sense that the land itself was watching. The people of Marrow County didn't talk about what they saw in the woods or why certain family graves were left unmarked. They lived by one unspoken rule: some things are better not spoken aloud. The Whitlocks were among the oldest families, their roots running deepest into that haunted soil. Their farmhouse stood on the highest ridge, its windows like eyes overlooking the valley. They were respected, feared, and pitied all at once. It was said that their blood had never mixed with anyone beyond the county line. Each generation carried the same pale skin, the same icy eyes that seemed to reflect the mist around them. To the townsfolk, the Whitlocks weren't just people, they were a reminder of the land's oldest truth. In Marrow County, blood didn't just bind families, it trapped them. Clara Whitlock was 12 when her family gathered in the candlelit barn on the ridge, where the scent of hay mixed with something older, something metallic and faintly sweet, like the memory of blood. The fog pressed against the wooden walls as if it wanted to be part of the ceremony. She wore a pale linen dress that once belonged to her mother, its hem brushing against the dusty floorboards, and a white ribbon tied tight around her wrist, a symbol of purity, her mother had whispered. No one had told her exactly what the night was for, only that it was tradition, and that all Whitlock daughters went through it when they were ready. Her cousin Eli stood at the other end of the barn, tall and solemn, his dark hair falling into eyes the same pale grey as hers. He was 18, quiet, and always carried an air of something unreadable, as though he knew more about the family's secrets than he should. Clara had always felt uneasy around him, not because he was cruel but because he looked at her the way the elders looked at the land, with possession, not affection. When their eyes met, she tried to smile, but the sound of the old clock ticking above the altar drowned out her breath. The elders formed a circle around them, holding hands, murmuring words Clara couldn't understand. Their voices rose and fell like waves, rhythmic and slow, until the air felt heavy enough to crush her chest. Her father stepped forward first, his face pale in the candlelight, and took her hand. "By blood, we bind," he said, and tied the end of her ribbon to Eli's wrist. The ribbon's knot tightened on its own, as though pulled by invisible fingers. Clara gasped, and one of the candles flickered out. The others didn't seem to notice. When the final vow was spoken, the barn went silent. Even the insects outside had stopped their endless summer song. Her mother kissed her forehead and whispered, "You are promised now." Clara looked at Eli, who smiled faintly and pressed her tied wrist to his lips. She didn't know what being promised meant, only that something inside her had shifted, something heavy and irreversible. As the night deepened, the fog seeped through the cracks in the barn, curling around their feet like smoke. Clara felt a chill run through her bones, a warning she couldn't name. The adults called it a sacred night, a moment of honor. But to Clara, it felt like being sealed inside a story she didn't want to belong to, a story written long before she was born and one she would never be allowed to escape. The Whitlocks had always believed that their blood carried something sacred, something beyond ordinary flesh and bone. It wasn't just pride that kept them marrying within the family, it was faith. They spoke often of the favor, a divine mark passed down from their ancestors who, according to family law, had been chosen by God himself to preserve a holy lineage. The story said that generations ago, when plague and famine struck the region, the Whitlocks alone remained untouched. Their crops thrived when others withered, their children lived when others buried theirs. From that miracle grew a belief that their bloodline was protected, and any dilution of it would mean losing that protection forever. To them, keeping their blood pure wasn't a sin, it was survival. This belief was whispered to every child before they could even write their name. It was in the prayers before meals, in the songs sung at harvest, in the carved symbols that marked the beams of their houses. Clara had grown up hearing that their family was different, set apart by God's hand. She never questioned it, not until the night of her promise to Eli. But the older she grew, the more she began to notice the cracks in that holiness. Some Whitlock children were born sickly, their limbs bent or their eyes clouded. A few never spoke, only hummed softly to themselves as if listening to something no one else could hear. The elders said those children were closer to the light, touched by something sacred. Others whispered that they were punishment for defying the natural order. When Clara asked her grandmother once why they never married outsiders, the old woman smiled without warmth and said, "Because outsiders don't understand what's in our blood. They fear it." Her voice carried both pride and warning. Clara didn't understand then, but she felt the unease beneath the words. The same unease she felt when church preachers from neighboring towns tried to visit and were quietly turned away. The Whitlocks had their own chapel, built with their own hands, and they said their prayers didn't need anyone else's blessing. To outsiders, the family's traditions were unsettling, even wrong. But within the valley, no one questioned them. The Whitlocks were landowners, healers, and gatekeepers of their own small world. And in that world, every marriage, every birth, every death was seen as part of a divine pattern. It didn't matter that science or outsiders would call it superstition. To the Whitlocks, the blood was sacred, and breaking that chain would be an act of betrayal not just against family, but against God himself. By the time Clara turned 17, the promise made in that candlelit barn had turned into a marriage that bound her tighter than the ribbon once had. Life on the Whitlock farm moved in its slow, unchanging rhythm, but inside the house, something had begun to shift. Eli had grown quieter, more watchful, and the whispers of the elders carried a strange reverence whenever they spoke of Clara's duty. She tried to find comfort in the silence of the hills, the endless fog, and the distant hum of cicadas, but even nature seemed to hold its breath around her. It wasn't long after that the sickness began, the morning weakness, the dizziness, the trembling in her hands. At first, she thought it was just exhaustion from tending to the fields and animals, but soon her mother's knowing look told her otherwise. When the doctor came, he spoke in a hushed tone, his eyes darting toward Eli as if afraid of what the truth might stir. "She's with child," he said finally, his words hanging in the still air like a curse. Clara felt her heart drop into her stomach. The doctor's brow furrowed when he pressed his stethoscope to her abdomen, his face tightening with confusion. The heartbeat he heard wasn't faint or irregular, it was strong, too strong, and there was something else, a rhythm that echoed unnaturally fast. "It's unusual," he murmured, avoiding their eyes. He advised rest and left quickly, but Clara caught the tremor in his voice when he added, "If she survives the birth, it'll be a miracle." Her pregnancy grew heavier by the week. Her skin turned pale as wax, and her veins darkened beneath the surface like blue roots. The child inside her seemed restless, kicking with a force that made her gasp. Some nights, she swore she could feel it moving even when she lay perfectly still, as though it wasn't asleep but aware. Eli would place his ear against her stomach, whispering words she didn't recognize, his voice low and rhythmic, almost ritualistic. The family's prayers turned from soft blessings to desperate chants, their eyes gleaming with the kind of faith that frightened her. As months passed, Clara's health faded, yet the life inside her only grew stronger. She dreamt of strange shapes forming in the fog, of the hills whispering her name. The doctor stopped coming, and the midwife refused to enter the house after hearing the child's heartbeat from across the room. By then, Clara no longer feared dying in childbirth, she feared surviving it, because deep down, she knew whatever was growing inside her wasn't entirely hers, and maybe not entirely human. After the night the child was born, the town fell into a silence that felt almost rehearsed. No one came to the farmhouse anymore, not even the few neighbors who used to trade milk or eggs. The doctor left Marrow County without saying goodbye, and the midwife who had run screaming from the delivery never spoke of what she saw. Within the Whitlock house, the air felt heavier, colder, and every candle seemed to burn a little dimmer. Clara tried to love the baby, to see him as hers, but each time she looked into his eyes, colorless, still, and far too knowing, she felt something inside her recoil. The child rarely cried. He slept through the nights without stirring, but when he was awake, he watched her as though studying her soul. The whispers began soon after. At the general store, men lowered their voices when Eli entered. The women at the church stopped inviting Clara to gatherings, claiming it was for her health. Children dared each other to run past the Whitlock property at night, swearing they could see strange lights moving in the windows. The old folks said it wasn't the first time something like this had happened. They spoke of the marked ones, children born every few generations among the Whitlocks who defied explanation, children who lived when they shouldn't have, who healed from wounds too quickly, who never seemed to age quite right. No one ever proved the stories true, but everyone knew they ended the same way. The child disappeared before adulthood, and the family never spoke of it again. Eli dismissed the rumors as jealousy, claiming their child was blessed, a sign that the family's blood was still pure. He seemed almost proud of the unease that followed them, his smile growing sharper each time someone avoided his gaze. But Clara could feel the fear beneath his pride. The house itself seemed to echo with sounds that didn't belong to either of them, soft footsteps in empty rooms, faint breathing behind closed doors. The baby's toys moved during the night, and once, Clara found handprints on the inside of the window glass, though the child couldn't yet walk. When she asked Eli to leave Marrow County, he refused. "This is where we belong," he said, his voice calm but distant. He spent hours in the cellar with old family journals, whispering to himself, tracing their bloodline back through centuries of names that all sounded the same. The more the town feared their child, the more Eli believed he was a miracle. Clara wasn't sure anymore. Some nights, when the fog pressed against the windows and the baby stared into the dark with unblinking eyes, she wondered if they had brought something back that was never meant to live among them. When word spread about the Whitlock child's strange survival, curiosity replaced fear for a time. Outsiders began to take notice, first a traveling physician, then a team of researchers from a nearby university who claimed to study rare genetic phenomena. They arrived in Marrow County with notebooks, instruments, and polite smiles that barely masked their unease. The townsfolk watched from their porches as the strangers drove up the long, winding road to the Whitlock farmhouse, vanishing into the fog that swallowed visitors whole. For a community that had lived untouched by outsiders for generations, their arrival felt like an intrusion, but for Clara, it was something closer to hope. Maybe, she thought, someone could finally explain what her son was. The scientists examined the child with careful precision, noting every anomaly they found. His pulse was irregular yet strong, his blood type unidentifiable. His body temperature remained constant, even in cold weather. He healed from cuts in hours rather than days. And his eyes, those pale, colorless eyes, seemed to respond to light in ways that baffled every test. One of the doctors, a woman with a voice barely above a whisper, told Clara that her son's DNA appeared unstable, something she had never seen before. She hesitated before adding, "It's as though his body is rewriting itself." The words stayed with Clara long after they left her mouth. Eli didn't trust them. He followed the researchers everywhere, watching each test with a stiff posture and an unblinking gaze. When they drew blood from the boy, Eli's face hardened. "You're not taking his spirit," he warned, his voice carrying the weight of something ancient. The scientists exchanged uneasy glances, thinking it superstition, but to Eli, their interference felt like blasphemy. He told them that their instruments could never measure what ran in Whitlock veins. "It's not science," he said quietly. "It's inheritance." When the results were finally shared, the team confessed they could not explain the child's survival. Every medical record, every biological law they knew had been defied. "He shouldn't be alive," one researcher admitted before leaving town for good. The others followed soon after, unwilling to stay where logic failed them. After they left, the house grew quieter, but not in peace. Clara felt their absence like a warning, as if even science had turned its back on her son. The townspeople avoided their gaze entirely now, whispering that the Whitlocks had fooled the doctors, that their child was not meant for this world. But at night, when the boy's breath echoed through the halls, too steady and too deliberate for a child his age, Clara began to wonder if the scientists were right, that something inside him was changing, rewriting itself into something new, something neither blessed nor human. Eli's fascination with their son grew with every passing day, twisting into an obsession that Clara could neither understand nor escape. From the moment the researchers had left, he devoted himself entirely to proving that their child was not merely alive, but a sign of divine favor. He spent hours poring over the family journals, tracing every generation's births, deaths, and peculiarities, muttering to himself in the dim light of the study. He marked patterns that no one else could see, convinced that each anomaly in their bloodline pointed to a destiny far greater than mortal understanding. He would hold the boy close, whispering prayers and formulas that Clara didn't recognize, pressing the child's pale face to his chest as though trying to draw the essence of some higher power into him. Clara watched all of this with growing dread. Eli's pride was no longer subtle, it had become a rigid, unyielding force, one that demanded recognition from everyone around him. He spoke openly of their child as proof that their blood was pure, that the family had been chosen to preserve something sacred through generations. But where he saw blessing, Clara saw a deepening horror. The boy's unblinking gaze, so still and detached, reflected nothing of human warmth, and yet Eli spoke to him as though he could understand every thought, every secret hidden in the fogged corners of the world. Nights were the worst. Eli would sit in the nursery for hours, murmuring scriptures and instructions, tracing symbols in the air above the child's crib. Clara would lie awake in the dark, listening to the soft, almost inaudible chant, feeling the air thicken around her, the shadows deepen, and the walls close in. The family began to change under Eli's obsession. The Whitlocks, already known for their strange practices, now took on a sharper, more vigilant edge. Friends and distant relatives stopped visiting, whispering that Eli was possessed by his devotion to the child, that the boy's presence was bending him into something unrecognizable. Clara tried to intervene, to reason with him, but Eli's answers were always the same. The boy was a gift, a living testament to generations of unbroken blood, and nothing, no fear, no warning, no outsider, could challenge that truth. Clara's own feelings grew more conflicted each day. She wanted to protect her son from the obsession that had consumed his father, but she also feared the boy himself. Every now and then, the child would move or speak in ways that were unnervingly deliberate, his eyes following Clara with a comprehension far beyond his age. She began to wonder whether Eli's devotion was misplaced, whether his insistence on proving divine favor might instead be feeding something darker, something lurking within the child that even he could not control. The line between miracle and curse blurred in the corners of the nursery, and Clara felt herself standing on the edge of a world she could no longer understand, a world shaped entirely by the obsession of a man who refused to see the danger he had invited into their home. As the boy grew, the house itself seemed to respond to his presence. At first, it was subtle, the air colder in rooms he entered, the shadows stretching longer than they should, the creak of floorboards when no one was there. Clara noticed it first, the way the family dog would stop barking mid-woof and stare at him with unease, ears flattened against its skull. Birds that once nested in the rafters refused to come near. Even the plants in the garden wilted when he wandered close, though he never touched them. Eli only laughed softly at these signs, calling them proof of the child's unique power, of a destiny the rest of the world could never comprehend. But the signs soon grew harder to dismiss. The boy's intelligence was startling, far beyond what any child of his age should possess. He read from books before he could speak fluently, solved puzzles the adults created for amusement, and seemed to anticipate events before they happened, moving just in time to avoid accidents or even pointing silently to prevent harm. Yet intelligence was not the only thing that unsettled the family. There was a coldness to his emotions, a detachment that felt unnatural. He could laugh, yes, and cry in imitation, but Clara sometimes caught him staring into the dark for hours, his eyes reflecting a knowledge she could not reach, as if he were listening to voices no one else could hear. The boy's behavior unnerved Eli as well, though he refused to admit it. One evening, Clara found him standing in the kitchen at midnight, staring at the baby's crib. Eli followed her gaze and smiled, but it was a strained, sharp smile that did not reach his eyes. Clara noticed it first, then she noticed the animals. Chickens in the coop dropped dead for no reason. A cat that had slept in the sunniest window for years vanished only to be found days later at the edge of the forest, still and lifeless. The boy had not touched them, yet the pattern was undeniable. The presence he carried seemed to warp the life around him, and Clara could feel the tension building in the air whenever he entered a room. Clara tried to warn Eli, pleading that they consider leaving Marrow County, that they seek help beyond superstition and obsession. He refused, insisting that the child's influence was divine, that the world outside could never understand the gift he carried. And yet, as the boy grew taller, as his footsteps echoed too softly for the size of his body and his gaze followed every movement in the house, Clara began to fear that Eli's pride in their child was blinding him. The signs were no longer subtle, the disturbances no longer isolated, and the child's uncanny detachment hinted at something neither miracle nor man could tame. Clara's own reflection in the windows seemed to bend around him, as if even her own image recoiled from the unnatural weight of the boy's presence. One rainy afternoon, as the fog pressed against the windows and the Whitlock house smelled of damp wood and candle smoke, Clara found herself in the attic, searching for anything that might explain the unease that had settled over her home. The air was thick with dust and the scent of old paper, and her fingers traced the edges of forgotten trunks and crates until she came upon a leather-bound diary, cracked and faded with age. The initials on the cover were familiar, G.W., her grandmother's handwriting looping in the familiar curl that Clara had once admired as a child. With trembling hands, she opened it, the pages brittle, and began to read the words written decades before she was born. The diary described a child, born to the Whitlock family 8 decades earlier, who shared the same pale eyes and unshakable stillness as her own son. That child had defied doctors' predictions, surviving injuries and illnesses that should have claimed him within weeks. The grandmother wrote of whispers among the townsfolk, of neighbors crossing themselves when they passed the house, and of a fear that spread like smoke whenever the child was awake. There were mentions of animals found dead, shadows in empty rooms, and lights that flickered for no reason. The pages were filled with careful observations, both admiring and horrified, as though the writer understood that this child was remarkable, but also dangerous. Clara read on, her pulse quickening, as the diary revealed the child's fate. One night, there had been screams so intense they could be heard across the valley, and when the family returned to the room where the child had slept, he was gone. No trace remained, and the family never spoke of him again. The grandmother's words carried both sorrow and relief, a recognition that the child's survival had come at a cost too heavy to bear. Every line Clara read felt like a warning etched into the wood and air of the house, as if history itself were whispering that patterns repeat, and that the past does not remain buried forever. The parallels were undeniable. The pale eyes, the unnatural strength, the unsettling calm, everything pointed to the possibility that history was circling back. Clara felt a cold weight settle on her chest, a mixture of fear and recognition. She realized that their child might not just be remarkable or blessed, he could be the reincarnation or continuation of a phenomenon that had haunted the Whitlocks for generations. The diary left her with a single, undeniable truth: whatever had happened decades ago was not over. The child in her arms could be following the same path, and unless she understood the lessons hidden in those pages, she risked repeating a cycle that had already claimed her ancestors' peace and sanity. Every creak in the house, every flicker of candlelight, every soft, deliberate movement of her son seemed charged with meaning now. Clara clutched the diary to her chest, her mind racing. She had uncovered a secret that could explain everything: the survival, the eyes, the unnatural quiet, but it also carried a warning that the living world might not survive, nor understand, the repetition of history in the hands of the next Whitlock child. By the time the boy turned 5, the weight of the past pressed on Clara like a storm she could neither see nor escape. The diary's warnings echoed in her mind with every step he took through the house, every glance from those unblinking eyes. She watched him move with the eerie precision of someone far older, calculating and aware, and she felt the pattern forming before her eyes, the same pattern that had once led a Whitlock child to vanish into the night, leaving only fear and whispers behind. Nights were no longer safe. The fog outside pressed against the windows, and shadows pooled in corners, stretching unnaturally long when he approached. Objects in the house moved inexplicably. The animals refused to sleep, and the silence of the wind carried whispers that Clara could almost understand, as though the past itself were speaking through her son. Eli, obsessed and unwavering, still insisted on celebrating what he believed to be a miracle. He took the boy to the ridge, pointing to the fog-covered hills, tracing patterns in the ground with a stick, and murmuring of divine favor and destiny. Clara followed reluctantly, her eyes scanning the surrounding trees and brush, half expecting to see the echoes of the Whitlock child from decades past. Every small misstep by the boy seemed deliberate, calculated, and every time he looked at her with that strange clarity, Clara felt the chill of inevitability settle deeper into her bones. She realized that her role was no longer only to protect him but to make a choice that could determine the fate of generations. The signs grew impossible to ignore. The boy healed from minor injuries almost instantly, his intellect continued to expand at an unnatural rate, and his presence seemed to warp the world around him in ways that were frighteningly precise. Clara tried to imagine a life beyond the ridge, beyond the house, beyond the bloodline that had trapped her family for centuries. But Marrow County was unforgiving, and even if she left, the fog and the land seemed to cling to her son as tightly as Eli did. She began to see that history wasn't just repeating itself, it was accelerating, drawing her toward a decision that could either save the child or break the chain of a bloodline that had been cursed and blessed in equal measure. Clara thought of the diary, of the screams, of the vanishing of the Whitlock child before her son. And in those quiet, terror-filled nights, she realized that the only way to protect what remained of her family and perhaps the world beyond the ridge was to confront the dark inheritance that had followed them for generations. She understood, with a clarity that shook her to the core, that the choices she made now would not only shape the boy's fate but could determine whether the cycle of the Whitlock bloodline continued or ended forever.